One of my favorite comedies of all time is Napoleon Dynamite. Now, Napoleon Dynamite, I love it. One of the characters in this movie is Uncle Rico. And Uncle Rico is this kind of stalled out, wistful bachelor who lives in the past. He lives out of his 1975 Dodge Tradesman van, and he just can't get out of the glory days, right? He can't move, he can't live in the present. There's this great kind of scene where he's sitting on the front steps with his nephew Kip, and they're just having a conversation. And time and time again, Uncle Rico is coming back to this moment in time back in high school. And he says, he turns to Kip, he says, back in '82, I used to be able to throw a football a quarter mile. And he says, they're looking off in the distance, and he says, how much you want to make a bet? I could throw a pigskin over them mountains. And the dialogue kind of continues, and then he says, he just kind of drifts off. And he says, if Coach would have put me in that fourth quarter, we would have been state champions, no doubt in my mind. I'd be making $1 million. I'd be playing pro. Then he asked Kip, he said, hey Kip, I reckon you know a lot about cyberspace? You ever read anything about time travel? And so the whole movie is his character returning to this theme of wishing he could turn back the clock and live in the past. Now, just full disclosure, before you decide to watch this movie, what you need to know is that the first time I ever saw it in high school, I went with my friends, I laughed uncontrollably the entire time, and I was the only one in the entire theater laughing. So, just so that you know, you either love it or you hate it. But Uncle Rico, he's stuck back in the glory days, wants to turn back the clock. And it's a recurring theme for him in the movie. But sometimes, it's a recurring theme for us in our lives. Now, why does that happen? We get kind of caught up in the way things were. Let me ask you this question. Let me ask you, in the last 2 weeks, have you said something like this? When things get back to normal. If you've said that in the last 2 weeks, I want you to type me into the chat, into the comments. Yeah, we do this. We want things to go back to normal. And I found myself saying this many times throughout the pandemic. When things get back to normal, when things get back to normal. I can't wait for things to get back to the way they were. We can just kind of go on with our lives. We get kind of stuck, attached to the way things were, like Uncle Rico. Now, if you're paying attention, you might have seen a similar dynamic played out in the first reading from the book of Exodus. So just for the sake of context, Moses, he just led the nation of Israel to freedom from out of Egypt. They're headed to the promised land. But right now, in this scene that we just read, they're trapped in the desert. The desert wilderness is kind of in-between place between where they were and where they're headed. And they're lost. They're wandering. They're lost in transition, right, between the way things were and the way things are going to be. Stuck in the middle. I felt a lot like that during the last 18 months. And so they start looking back to the way things were in the past. The scripture tells us they start to complain. And it says, the whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the desert. Moses is the prophet. He's leading the people. Aaron is his younger, smarter, better-looking younger brother, like me and Father Simon. Right? Now the Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the hand of the Lord in Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. In other words, their complaint, they're saying, if only we could go back to Egypt, when we could eat whatever we wanted, when we were full, at least we would have died with full stomachs. If only we could turn back the clock, right? And sit next to our flesh pots. You know, flesh pots. You must think about your flesh pots all the time. We all love our flesh. I think of Moses talking to the Israelites. Like, if you complain one more time, I'm going to punch you right in the flesh pot, you know? What is a flesh pot? It's a funny word. I like saying it. It's just a pot full of meat. That's it. And for the Israelites, it represents what they lost. It represents the past. It represents full stomachs and a world of predictability. And so, like Uncle Rico, they have this nostalgia for the past. They just want to go back to the way things were. Why do we do that? Why do we often get so attached to the way things were? Now, sometimes I think we live in the past as an escape from the problems of the present. Sometimes it's easier to hearken back to a time in the past rather than face the reality of the challenges of today and have to grapple with them ourselves. Another reason I think sometimes we get trapped in the past is because we're afraid of what the future holds. Right? Because at least, maybe the past wasn't all that great, but at least it was predictable. At least we knew what was going to happen. At least we knew what to do. And now things are crazy. They're unpredictable. We don't know what to expect. We don't know where we're going. We don't know what the future holds. It's scary. And perhaps the scariest question of all that I think sometimes we don't even acknowledge to ourselves is this question: what if my best days are behind me? We might even ask that question as a church. What if the best days of our church, what if the best days of St. Benedict are behind us? Because the truth is, if I don't believe that what the future holds is better than today, then of course I'm going to cling to the past and the way things were. Like the Israelites, we're headed through this time of transition. We're kind of stuck in the middle between the way things were and where we're headed. And just like the Israelites, they didn't know. No one had ever seen the promised land. No one knew what it looked like. No one had ever been there. And just like us, we're not headed to the promised land, but we're headed to a post-pandemic world, and we don't know what it looks like. But we know that we're in the midst of this global shift. Religiously, but demographically, sociologically, economically, politically, religiously. And I've heard it said that, if the church in the West was on decline before the pandemic, things have just been accelerated by 10 years. All the data we're seeing is that globally, is that churches that have been open for months with no restrictions, they're seeing somewhere between 40% and 70% of their people come back to church. And so the reality is that we might end up on the other side of this with half the church we went in with. And so this question kind of rises to the surface. Are our best days behind us? See, there is no getting back to normal. Because the world we live in, it's changing. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know what the future holds for our families, for ourselves, or for the church. And so, one response is to cling to the way things were, to have nostalgia for bread and flesh pots. But there's another response. As followers of Jesus, as believers, as the people of faith, there's another way to respond to this time in which we're in. See, there's lots that I don't know about what the future holds, but what I do know is this. When Israel was at its weakest and most dependent, when they were lost and they didn't know what to do, when they were in this time of total uncertainty, it was then that God provided for his people. As the scriptures say, the Lord said to Moses, I am going to rain down bread from heaven for you. And each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way, I will test them, whether they will follow my instruction or not. You see, in other words, God himself is going to feed his people. God himself is going to provide for their needs. God himself is going to give them everything that they need to bring them to the place that he has provided for them, that he has called them to. And he is calling them to depend on him day after day after day after day. And he did. God rained down manna from heaven, this miraculous bread, as the scriptures call it, the bread of angels. And God fed his people every single day, and every day they found themselves in a place where they had to depend on him to provide for them. And he did. You see, here's the thing about the time in the desert wilderness. When we find ourselves in the desert wilderness, that's the place God provides. God provides when we're on the journey. He provides for the journey. When we're on the journey, that's the place of provision. That's when we experience ourselves as dependent on God, and also where God provides. It's like God is saying, God leads us into the wilderness so that he says this, you don't need anything but me. I will provide for you. Do you trust me? Do you trust me with the way things were? Do you trust me with today? And do you trust your future into my hands? Will you trust me to take care of you and to provide for you? And that's the question God is asking each and every one of us today. And that's why we don't have to be afraid of the future, because it's God himself who is leading us and feeding us. It's God himself who has prepared a place for us to go, the promised land. And let me tell you, I'm actually pretty excited about where God is calling us. There are so many times during this pandemic where as a church, as an individual, I had no idea what to do. There were times early on when Father Simon and I were having conversations about what it would be like to not receive a salary, to not get paid for our ministry. There was conversations we had with the whole archdiocese about all the priests not being able to get paid because we didn't know what the financial situation was going to look like. But you know what? God provided. In fact, in many ways, we're healthier financially today than we have ever been. And what's more, when we found ourselves, suddenly we woke up and the doors of our church had to be locked for the first time in my life. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know how we were going to serve our people. We didn't know how we were going to continue to live out our mission of making disciples. But you know what? God opened new doors. He showed us new ways of doing ministry that we could never have even imagined. We never even would have believed would have worked in a pre-pandemic world. And you know what? Last year, we had more people go through Alpha than any other year in our church's history. We brought more people into life groups than we ever did in any prior year to 2020. We had stories and stories and stories of people whose lives have been changed by the ministry that we're doing online in this online world that we never would have even tried if it wasn't for the global pandemic. You see, God was providing and working in and through our church in this time. And in this time, I think personally, but also as a church, we're going to emerge from the pandemic more humble, more resilient, more innovative, and most importantly, more dependent on God than ever before. And it's like this time of transition, this time in the desert wilderness, is a time of preparation for what's to come. You see, because I believe God is preparing us to do something amazing. I believe that God has been at work in our lives to prepare us for a big new move that He's going to do. That God is going to move in a new way, in an unexpected way, and He's going to do new things in our lives. And I believe that God is saying to you and to us, your best days are not behind you, they're before you. And you can't possibly imagine all that I have prepared for you. I feel like God is saying that what you've seen to date as a church, the kind of global impact you've had on churches all around the world through divine renovation, the decade of disciples and legacy of transformed lives, people's lives who've been touched by your ministry, is just the beginning of all that I want to accomplish in you and through you. God is going to do amazing new things in our lives if enough of us trust Him today. If enough of us make the decision to place our future and our present and our past into the hands of God. If enough of us open our hearts and our lives to say, God, I want to be radically dependent on you, and I want you to feed me and lead me to the place you have provided for me. If enough of us do that, God is going to work. God is going to do amazing new things, and He will provide for us on the journey as He leads us to the place He has prepared for us.